The morning my grandmother was buried, my mother was already on the phone with her financial advisor. I noticed it from across the church parking lot, the way she stepped aside from the reception crowd and pressed her cell to her ear, one hand shielding her mouth like she was protecting a secret from the wind. My father stood near her, nodding steadily at whatever the voice on the other end was saying. My sister Cassandra stood between them in a black dress that had arrived in a garment bag from a boutique in Columbus, her heels sinking almost imperceptibly into the soft cemetery ground. I was standing near the folding tables with the casseroles, holding a paper plate I hadn't eaten from. Watching. My grandmother's name was Eleanor Ruth Baxter. She was 79 years old when she died on March 4, 2022, in the house she'd owned for 41 years in Beaumont, Ohio. She had blue eyes that could catch a lie from across a room, a garden she tended until her knees wouldn't let her, and a habit of writing important things down in her careful, slanted handwriting and tucking them into plain white envelopes. She also had a lawyer. His name was Gerald Mott. He had handled her legal affairs for 22 years from a small office on Vine Street, 2 blocks from the county courthouse. Before my mother could spend a single dollar of what she had redirected out of my account and into my sister's, Gerald Mott called me. But I am getting ahead of myself. If this story is already sitting somewhere familiar in your chest, hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss what's coming. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I genuinely love hearing from you. I grew up in Beaumont, Ohio, a mid-sized town about 40 minutes southwest of Columbus. Not small enough to be charming, not large enough to be anonymous. The kind of place where everyone knows your name at the school board meetings, where you see the same 30 families at every church picnic and every little league game, where reputations are built slowly and dismantled quickly. My parents, Dennis and Carol Haverford, had lived in Beaumont their entire lives. My father worked in municipal planning for the county, steady government work, good benefits, 27 years of quiet, dependable service. My mother was the office manager at a pediatric dental practice. She had worked there since I was 6 years old. She knew every patient's family by name, knew who paid on time and who was 3 months behind on their co-pays, knew how to keep every moving part of a complicated system running without anyone noticing how much work it actually took. She was organized. She was efficient. She knew how things worked, and she knew how to make things work in her favor without anyone being able to point to exactly what she had done. My sister Cassandra was 3 years older than me. She had our mother's gift for walking into a room and being noticed, something in the way she held herself, the way she smiled at exactly the right moment, the way she could make whoever she was talking to feel like the most interesting person in the space. People liked Cassandra. Teachers liked her. Neighbors liked her. My parents adored her in the uncomplicated, open way some parents adore one child and manage the other. I don't say that to be bitter. I say it because it is simply the most accurate description of how our household operated. Cassandra was the event. I was the setup. My mother's attention worked on a fixed economy. She had a certain amount of it, and Cassandra's needs were expensive. Cassandra's cheerleading competitions, her homecoming court preparations, her college applications, her friend drama, her boyfriend drama, her career uncertainty after graduation, her apartment furnishings, her car, all of it cost attention, and my mother paid willingly. Eagerly, even. My needs, by contrast, were quiet. I got good grades without being reminded. I kept my room clean without being asked. I managed my problems privately and did not bring them to the kitchen table. This was not discipline. It was self-preservation. I had learned early that asking for things produced a particular kind of fatigue in my mother's expression that I hated seeing, not anger, exactly, just a faint recalibration, like she was adding a line item to a budget she hadn't planned for. So I stopped asking. I handled things myself. And because I handled things myself, the family concluded I didn't need much. My grandmother Eleanor saw it. I believe she had seen it for years. She called me on Tuesday evenings, not my mother, not Cassandra, me, and asked about school, about whatever book I was reading, about what I wanted to do eventually. She had opinions on everything and shared them with a frankness I found deeply comforting. She told me once that the quietest person in any room was usually the one paying the most attention. I've thought about that line more times than I can count. When I was 14 years old, she told me she was putting money aside for me. For your future, she said. Not for college specifically. For whatever you decide your future needs to be. I don't want you waiting on anyone else's permission to build the life you want. She meant it. She showed it in the only language she trusted completely, a paper record, a legal arrangement, a man she'd known for 22 years who kept documents filed in the correct order. The fund grew steadily over the following years. She deposited on birthdays, at Christmas, occasionally in larger amounts she never fully explained. By the time I graduated from Ohio State in May 2019 with a degree in health information management, the fund held $89,400. I knew the exact amount because she had told me directly. March of that year, 2 months before graduation, sitting at her kitchen table. She'd put on her reading glasses, pulled a single sheet of paper from a white envelope, read the balance aloud, and set the paper down. Then she looked at me over the top of the glasses. "This is yours," she said. "When you're ready, it's yours. I've made the arrangements. Mr. Mott handles everything. You don't need to worry." I didn't worry. I trusted her completely. What I didn't know was what my parents had been doing in the background. What I didn't know was that my grandmother's health was declining more significantly than anyone had shared with me. What I didn't know was that my mother, who managed schedules for a living, who knew how to control access to information, who understood exactly how much power came from being the person in the room who knew what others did not, had been managing my grandmother's situation very carefully. Deciding who visited and when. What was communicated and to whom. What was quietly withheld. I didn't know any of it yet. And because I trusted the wrong people for too long, I didn't ask the right questions until it was almost too late. After graduation, I took a position at Midwest Regional Health System as a health data analyst. Entry level, $44,000 a year, full benefits. I moved into an apartment in Columbus with 2 other women from my program. My life was not glamorous, but it was mine, and it was beginning to take shape in a way that felt purposeful. Cassandra, at that point, was 25, living back in Beaumont, working inconsistently at a marketing firm that had already gone through 2 rounds of restructuring. She and my mother spoke every single day. I called home maybe twice a month. My mother usually spent the first portion of those calls updating me on Cassandra, what Cassandra was dealing with, what Cassandra was considering, what Cassandra needed right now. I had learned to listen to these calls accurately. When my mother said Cassandra was going through something, it meant someone was going to be asked to help in a concrete way, and that someone was rarely in a position to refuse without becoming the problem. In October 2020, Cassandra's marketing firm folded entirely. She lost her job, her lease expired the same month, and she moved back into my parents' house. My mother called to tell me. She sounded worried in the specific way she sounded whenever Cassandra was in difficulty, not afraid, but activated, like a plan was already forming. "We need to help her get back on her feet," my mother said. "She's been talking about starting something of her own. A boutique, a lifestyle and home goods concept. She has such good taste, Leah. She just needs a runway." I said something supportive. I don't remember what, exactly. What I registered was the word runway, not a plan, not savings she'd accumulated, not capital she'd earned, but a runway. Provided by someone else. I didn't imagine it would be my grandmother's money. That didn't even occur to me. My grandmother had her first serious health episode in February 2021. A stroke, mild, the doctors said, managed well given her age. Her left hand tremored slightly afterward, but her mind stayed sharp. She was home within 4 days. My mother organized the in-home aid schedule, coordinated with the physician, managed all of the logistics with the efficiency she brought to everything. I offered to come home for a weekend to help. My mother said it was handled. There was no need. I took her at her word. I visited in April. Grandma Eleanor was thinner than the last time I'd seen her, but she was alert and warm and she asked me all the right questions. We sat at her kitchen table and she asked about Columbus, about my work, about whether I was happy. I told her I was building something. She nodded in the specific way she nodded when she already believed what you were telling her. Then she said something that I would replay many times in the months that followed. Your mother asks a lot of questions about your fund. About the arrangements with Mr. Mott. I looked up. What kind of questions? She looked at me for a moment, steady, careful, the way she looked when she was deciding how much to say. I told her the arrangements were made and Gerald handles everything. She smiled and we moved on. She brought out lemon cookies and told me about the neighbor's new dog getting into her garden. I didn't press. I wish I had. But she seemed settled about it, and I didn't want to worry unnecessarily, and I made the mistake of letting it pass. She had a second stroke in October 2021. More severe this time. 8 days in the hospital. She came home with additional support, a second aide during the day, and for the first time struggled to follow a conversation the way she used to. My mother was there nearly every day. I was in Columbus, calling every few days, being told things were stable, being told there was nothing I could do from there that wasn't already being handled. In January 2022, my mother called on a Sunday afternoon and mentioned, almost in passing, that my grandmother had signed paperwork authorizing my parents as co-administrators of her personal accounts during her recovery period. She said it in the same flat, informational tone she used to discuss routine logistics. She mentioned it once and moved on to other topics. I registered it distantly, something legal and practical, one more thing my mother was managing, and I let it pass the way I let so many things pass. Without pressing. Without asking what co-administration actually covered. Without asking what doors it opened. My grandmother died on March 4, 2022. Peacefully, in her own home, in the bed she'd slept in for 41 years. Her aide was with her. My parents arrived within the hour. I got the call from my mother at 6:47 in the morning. I drove to Beaumont that same day. I cried most of the way there with the radio off. The funeral was on March 8, 84 people attended. Half of Beaumont had known Eleanor Baxter for decades. The church was warm and full of dried flower arrangements she had made herself over the years, the kind that lasted long after the season they came from. People told me she was a woman who kept her word. Who showed up when it mattered. Who gave without making you feel the weight of what she gave. I stood near the folding tables. I held my paper plate. I watched my mother on her phone. I told myself it was estate coordination. I told myself it was normal logistics. I told myself my mother was handling things the way she always handled things, completely, efficiently, without needing to explain herself to anyone. I told myself a lot of things in those first few weeks, because the alternative was a thought I wasn't ready to have. The first clear signal that something was wrong came in early April. I called Gerald Mott's office to introduce myself properly and ask about next steps regarding the fund. I had never formally initiated any conversation with him beyond a brief introduction years earlier. I was 26 now, employed, saving slowly, and it seemed like the right time to understand what my grandmother had left me and how to access it when I was ready. The woman who answered, Gerald's longtime assistant, Rhonda, paused for a half-second too long when I gave my name. Miss Haverford. Can you hold for just one moment? I held for 4 minutes. When Gerald himself came on the line, his voice was careful in a way that tightened something in my chest immediately. Leah. Thank you for calling. I've been meaning to reach out to you directly. I think it would be better if we met in person. Would you be available this week? I drove to Beaumont on Thursday. Gerald Mott's office was exactly what you'd expect from a man who had practiced law in the same county for 3 decades. Wood-paneled walls, framed civic acknowledgments, a bookshelf that held more file binders than books. He was in his early 60s, wire-rimmed glasses, a plain blue tie. He shook my hand, gestured to the chair across from his desk, and set a thin folder in front of him without ceremony. He folded his hands on top of it. He looked at me directly. "Your grandmother was very specific with me about her intentions for your education fund," he said. "She told me on multiple occasions that the fund was designated for you personally and that I was to contact you directly when the time came. I should have reached out sooner after her passing. That delay was an oversight on my part, and I want to apologize for it." He opened the folder. "I've received documentation indicating that your parents, acting as co-administrators of your grandmother's personal accounts during her final months, authorized a transfer of $89,400 from the account designated as your fund to an account held in your sister's name. The transfer was dated February 28, 2022. 4 days before your grandmother passed." The room was very quiet. A car moved past on Vine Street outside. Somewhere in the building, a window unit hummed faintly. "They transferred my fund to my sister," I said. My voice came out flat and even, which surprised me. Gerald nodded. "Without your knowledge or consent, and critically, without authorization from me. That account was not covered under the co-administration document your mother presented. The co-administration agreement applied to your grandmother's personal household accounts, her checking, her utilities, her day-to-day finances. Your fund was a separately designated trust instrument that I administered independently. Your parents did not have the authority to touch it." He held my gaze steadily. "Your grandmother was thorough, Leah. She anticipated this possibility." He reached into the folder and removed a plain white envelope. My name was written on the front in her handwriting. One word. Her slant. Her careful, deliberate hand. "She left this with me 2 years ago," he said. "With specific instructions that it was only to be opened in the event that someone attempted to redirect the fund without your consent." He slid the envelope across the desk toward me. "I'm going to step out and give you a few minutes," he said. "And then I'd like to walk you through what I believe your options are." He stood quietly and left the room, pulling the door closed behind him. I sat alone in Gerald Mott's office with my grandmother's envelope in my hands. My coat was still on. The folder was open in front of me. Outside, Vine Street carried on as it always did, unhurried, ordinary, unchanged. I opened the envelope slowly. The paper inside was a single page, dated November 3, 2020, 14 months before she passed. She had written it in the same measured, direct way she wrote everything, no flourishes, no sentimentality, just the truth laid flat on the page the way she had always delivered it. "My dear Leah, if you are reading this, it is because someone tried to take what I set aside for you. I hope I am wrong. I hope Mr. Mott never needs to open this envelope at all. But I know my daughter, and I know how money looks to her when things are difficult and someone she loves needs it. The fund is yours. It was always yours. I have made sure that Gerald has everything he needs to prove it and to recover it on your behalf if necessary. Do not let anyone make you feel guilty for claiming what belongs to you. You were always the one who didn't ask for much. I saw that from the time you were small. You handled things yourself and you never made it anyone else's problem. I always admired that about you, and I always worried about it too. This is my way of making sure that the one who never asked gets what she was always owed. Go build the life you were going to build. Don't let them make that smaller than it should be. Love, Gran." I sat in that office for a long time. Long enough that the light from the window moved slightly across the floor. When Gerald came back in, I looked up. My voice, when I found it, was steady. "Tell me what my options are," I said. "All of them." He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and opened the folder to the next page. Gerald laid it out methodically, the way I imagined he laid everything out, without drama, without softening, just the facts arranged in the order they mattered. The co-administration document my mother had presented to the bank, he explained, had been signed by my grandmother in November 2021, during the period following her second stroke when her mobility and daily capacity had diminished. The document was legal. He had no question about that. What it was not, however, was broad enough to cover the separately administered trust account he had maintained on my grandmother's behalf for the past 14 years. That account carried its own documentation, its own governing terms, and a clear designated beneficiary, me, that predated the co-administration agreement by over a decade. My mother had gone around him entirely. She hadn't called his office. She hadn't presented the trust documents to the bank. She had walked into a branch where she was a known co-administrator of Eleanor Baxter's accounts and authorized a transfer before anyone thought to ask whether this particular account was covered. 4 days before my grandmother died. I sat with that for a moment. I let the arithmetic of it settle, the timing, the planning required, the calculation of exactly how close to the end was close enough that no one would question a co-administrator managing paperwork. I thought about my mother standing at the bank counter. I thought about her voice when she'd called to tell me about the co-administration agreement, how flat and casual it had been. How she'd moved on to other topics within the same breath. Gerald had already filed a formal notice with the bank challenging the transfer on the grounds that the account fell outside the co-administration scope. He had documentation, the original trust instrument, the designation records, 14 years of correspondence between himself and my grandmother, that clearly established the account's separate status. He anticipated the bank's compliance department would move to reverse the transfer within 60 to 90 days pending review, though he wanted me to understand there was a process and it would require patience. He also told me there was something else. My grandmother, in addition to the envelope she had left for me, had left a notarized statement with his office dated the same day, November 3, 2020. In it, she explicitly stated that the fund designated for Leah and Haverford was not to be redirected, liquidated, transferred, or otherwise altered without Leah and Haverford's written consent and his co-signature as administering attorney. She had, in his words, closed every door she could think of. She just couldn't close them all, he said. Your mother found the one she didn't anticipate. But your grandmother anticipated that too, which is why the letter exists, and why I have everything I need to pursue this. Do my parents know you have all of this? I asked. Not yet, he said. I wanted to speak with you first. I drove back to Columbus that evening. I stopped once at a rest area on I-70 and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes with the engine running. I was not crying, exactly. I was something past crying, in the still, clear space that sometimes comes after a shock when your body has already processed what your mind is still catching up to. My grandmother had seen it coming. She had known her daughter well enough to write a letter for a possibility she hoped would never happen, and she had been right, and she had made sure I would not be left without recourse. That was the truest expression of who Eleanor Baxter had been, not the money itself, but the care she had taken to protect it. The specificity of her love. I thought about what she had written. You were always the one who didn't ask for much. I saw that from the time you were small. I pulled back onto the highway and drove home. I did not call my parents that night. I did not call them the next day, or the day after. I needed to understand exactly what had happened before I said a word to either of them, because I knew, with a certainty that surprised me by how fully formed it was, that the moment I revealed what I knew, the story would start to shift. My mother would begin constructing the version of events she intended to deliver, and if I had not already gathered everything I needed, I would be standing in the middle of her narrative rather than my own. So I worked quietly. I called Gerald every few days for updates. I requested my grandmother's bank records for the 12 months preceding her death through the estate process Gerald was managing. I pulled every document related to the co-administration agreement, what it covered, what it explicitly excluded, who had been present when my grandmother signed it. I made a folder on my laptop and I filled it slowly and carefully over the following weeks. What I found made the original fact of the transfer feel almost secondary. My grandmother had signed the co-administration document on November 9, 2021. Gerald confirmed she had been competent at the time of signing, alert, oriented, aware of what she was authorizing. He had spoken with her aide and reviewed the medical notes. There was no question about her mental capacity in November. What was interesting was the timeline. My mother had introduced the co-administration paperwork 6 weeks after my grandmother's second stroke, framing it to the family as practical planning. Responsible, proactive. The kind of thing a loving, organized daughter does when her elderly mother's health is declining. No one questioned it. Why would they? It sounded exactly right. But I found something in the bank records that Gerald had not yet seen. In December 2021, 2 months before my grandmother died, there had been 2 other transfers from my grandmother's personal checking account, accounts fully covered by the co-administration agreement. One was $14,000 to an account I didn't recognize immediately. The second was $6,200 to the same account 10 days later. I cross-referenced the account number against the paperwork from Cassandra's new business, the boutique she had launched in January 2022 called Wren & Company, a lifestyle and home goods shop she'd opened in a rented storefront on Beaumont's main commercial street. The account number matched Cassandra's business operating account. $20,000 moved from my grandmother's personal accounts to Cassandra's business before my grandmother had even passed. Before the boutique had even opened its doors. And then, 4 days before she died, another $89,400. The total my sister had received, directly or indirectly, from my grandmother's accounts in the final 3 months of her life, came to $109,400. My grandmother had not designated any of that to Cassandra. My grandmother had, in fact, left Cassandra a specific and separate bequest in her will, $12,000 and her pearl earrings, items she had clearly and deliberately chosen. Everything beyond that had been moved without her authorization, during a period when my mother controlled access to her accounts and, increasingly, to my grandmother herself. I sat with all of that for a long time. Not just the numbers, but the shape of it. The sequence. The way my mother had used legitimate tools, the co-administration agreement, her proximity, her organizational competence, her reputation as a devoted daughter managing a difficult situation, to do something that was not legitimate at all. She hadn't forged anything. She hadn't broken any law in a simple, obvious way. She had moved carefully through the spaces between what was authorized and what wasn't, and she had been banking on the assumption that no one was watching closely enough to notice the difference. She had not accounted for Gerald Mott. She had not accounted for my grandmother's white envelope. And she had not accounted for me finally asking the right questions. I called my mother on a Tuesday evening in May 2022. 6 weeks after Gerald's office. I had not spoken to her beyond 2 brief, surface-level calls in the intervening time, and I had given her no reason to suspect anything had changed. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and normal. I asked about the fund. Directly, without preamble. I told her I had been in contact with Gerald Mott and that I understood a transfer had been made from my grandmother's account to Cassandra's in the final days of February. There was a pause. Not long, my mother was not someone who took long pauses. But it was there. Mom thinks about your long-term security too, she said. Your grandmother wanted the family to be taken care of. Cassandra needed capital to get her business started, and we made a family decision that the funds could serve that purpose temporarily. Temporarily, I said. Cassandra will pay it back once the business is established. $89,000. Leah, don't make this into something dramatic. We made a practical decision during a very difficult time. Gerald says you didn't have authorization to touch that account. Another pause. Slightly longer this time. Gerald is an old man who misunderstood the scope of the paperwork. Your father and I had full authority over your grandmother's accounts. Not that one, I said. That one was separate. He has 14 years of documentation saying so. We'll sort it out, she said, her voice tightening at the edges. These things take time. Gerald is being overly technical about a situation that the family handled in good faith. Good faith, I said, quietly. Yes. We were managing an estate in the middle of grief. We did the best we could. I did not tell her what else I had found. I did not mention the 2 December transfers. I did not tell her about the notarized statement or the envelope. I said I understood and that I was sure it would be sorted out, and I got off the phone. She believed I was going to let it go. She had spent 26 years learning that I handled things quietly and privately and without making them anyone else's problem. She assumed that pattern would hold. That was her second miscalculation, after underestimating Gerald Mott. She did not know that I had already decided I was done being the quiet one. Gerald filed the formal challenge with the bank in late May. The bank's compliance department opened a review. My father called me twice in June, both times leaving voicemails about how family handled things internally and how lawyers only made situations more complicated and expensive than they needed to be. I did not return either call. My mother sent a text that said simply, "Can we please talk about this like adults?" I responded, "Gerald is handling it." She did not text again after that. The bank's review concluded in August 2022. The compliance department determined that the fund account had been held under a separate trust instrument that the co-administration agreement did not cover. The transfer of $89,400 had not been authorized under the applicable documentation. The bank issued a reversal notice and informed my parents that the funds would be returned to the trust account pending Gerald's formal distribution to me as the designated beneficiary. The letter to my parents was sent on August 17. Gerald called me that morning before it arrived. "It's done," he said. "The funds will be distributed to you within 30 days. There's one more thing your grandmother wanted me to give you at this stage." He mailed it the same day. A second envelope, smaller than the first. Inside was a single card in her handwriting, undated, as though she had written it knowing it might be needed at any point along the way. "I told you Gerald handles everything. Now go. Gran." I held that card for a long time. Then I put it in the folder with everything else and I made myself dinner and I sat at my kitchen table in Columbus and I let myself feel the full weight of what had just resolved. Not triumph. Something quieter. Something that felt like the ground being level again after years of standing on a slope and having been told it was flat. The $89,400 was returned to the trust account on September 9, 2022. Gerald distributed it to me on September 14. I opened a separate account at a bank my parents had no knowledge of and no connection to. I sat with the balance for several weeks before I touched it. I wasn't ready to spend it yet. I needed to understand what I wanted it to do before I asked it to do anything. If you're still here, if this story is landing somewhere real for you, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Your support is what makes me able to keep bringing you stories like this one. It genuinely means everything. In the meantime, my parents' response to the bank's reversal was not silence. It was offense. My father left a voicemail on September 16, 2 days after Gerald distributed the funds. His voice had the careful, controlled quality he used when he was genuinely angry but had decided to perform calm. He said that what I had done was a betrayal of the family. That I had taken a private family matter and involved lawyers and institutions instead of sitting down and having a conversation. That my grandmother would have been heartbroken to see her estate turned into a legal dispute. That Cassandra's business was struggling now because of the disruption and that I needed to think about what I was doing to my sister. I replayed the voicemail once. Then I saved it to a folder on my phone labeled evidence and did not respond. Cassandra called 2 days later. Her tone was different from my father's, not angry, but wounded in that particular way Cassandra had always been wounded when the world did not arrange itself around her needs. She said she hadn't known the fund was supposed to be mine specifically. She said Mom had told her it was a family resource that Grandma had left for everyone to share. She said she felt terrible about the whole situation and she wished I had just talked to her directly instead of making it into a whole legal thing. I asked her one question. "Did you ask Mom whether the money was specifically designated to me?" A pause. "No," she said. "I just assumed Mom knew what she was doing." "I know," I said. "That's the problem." I did not have another conversation with Cassandra for 8 months. My mother's response came in the form of a narrative, the same tool she had always reached for when facts became inconvenient. She began telling people, neighbors, extended family, women from her church, that there had been a misunderstanding about Eleanor's accounts and that Leah had overreacted and involved a lawyer over a family decision made in good faith during a period of grief. She never said I was wrong, exactly. She said I had been inflexible. Legalistic. That I had chosen a legal process over family conversation. That she was heartbroken by it. I heard this secondhand from my Aunt Vera, my father's sister, who lived in Dayton and called me in October out of a concern I could tell was genuine. I'm not sure what's being said is the full picture, Vera said carefully. I thought you should know what's circulating. I thanked her. I sent her the basic facts in an email, no documents, no detail beyond the essential truth, and I asked her to use her own judgment. She replied with 2 words, I understand. That was enough. I spent the fall of 2022 working and thinking and making small, deliberate decisions about the $89,400. I did not rush. My grandmother had spent 14 years building that fund carefully, and the least I could do was spend it with the same care. By December, I had a plan. In January 2023, I enrolled in a graduate program in health informatics at Ohio State, part-time, evenings, so I could continue working full-time at Midwest Regional. The program cost $34,800 over 2 years. I paid the first year's tuition in full from the fund. $14,000. Unhesitating. The remaining $74,600 I split carefully. A portion into a high-yield savings account. A portion into a modest investment account I opened with the help of a fee-only financial advisor I found through my company's employee assistance program. A portion set aside, deliberately, for something I didn't have a name for yet but felt was coming, some future moment when I would need the ability to act on my own terms without asking anyone's permission. I was not thinking about revenge. I was not thinking about confrontation. I was thinking about the rest of my life and how I intended to build it, on ground my grandmother had made level, on a foundation no one had the authority to pull out from under me. The confrontation, when it came, was not something I arranged. It arranged itself around me, the way certain moments do when the right conditions finally align, when someone overconfident finally chooses the wrong audience and the wrong room on the wrong afternoon. It came at Easter. April 2023. My parents held their annual Easter dinner, a tradition my mother had maintained for 20-some years, 12 to 16 people, glazed ham, the good china, the particular performance of a family that had its act together. My Aunt Vera came. My father's brother Paul and his wife. 3 of my parents' longtime friends from the neighborhood. And Cassandra, of course, at her usual position at my mother's right hand at the table. I had not been invited the year before. My mother had told Vera I had declined, which was untrue, I had simply not been asked. This year, my father called personally in March and said they hoped I would come. His voice had the practiced ease of a man who believed that time softened everything and that families returned to their arrangements if you waited long enough. I said I would think about it. I called Vera, who confirmed she would be there and that she thought I should come. I decided to go. Not because I had forgiven anything. Not because I thought the dinner would be comfortable. But because something in me recognized that sooner or later this particular conversation had to happen in front of people who mattered, and my mother was going to choose the room whether I was in it or not. I decided I would rather be there. I wore a plain gray dress and low heels. I brought wine and a plant for the table. I was composed the way you are composed when you have spent months preparing for something without fully admitting to yourself that you were preparing for it. The first hour was careful. Cordial on the surface, every sentence slightly pressurized beneath it. Cassandra showed me photos of the boutique on her phone. Wren and Company had survived, barely, and was now carrying a small but loyal clientele. She was proud of it. I could see that genuinely. I told her it looked beautiful. I meant it. My mother watched these exchanges with the attentiveness of someone managing a very delicate arrangement of china that she was not entirely sure would survive the afternoon. We sat down to dinner at 2 o'clock. The ham was perfect. The table looked exactly as it always looked. My father said grace. My mother poured wine. Paul told a story about his drive down from Cleveland. Dara asked me about my graduate program, and I told the table I was finishing my first year in health informatics at Ohio State, on track, enjoying it. My mother smiled pleasantly at that and said nothing. The moment arrived at the precise instant I could not have scripted but somehow recognized before it fully formed. My mother's friend Linda, a woman I had known peripherally since childhood, the wife of one of my father's old colleagues, turned to me over the salad course and asked, in the bright, polished tone of someone making conversation at a dinner party, whether I was still working at the same hospital system. I said yes, and that I had been promoted in the fall to senior analyst. Linda said that was wonderful. Then she turned to my mother and said, a little conspiratorially, you must be so proud of both your girls. Cassandra with her shop and Leah with her career. You raised them right, Carol. My mother smiled. That warm, practiced smile. We do our best, she said. Leah's always been the steady one. Not flashy, but reliable. Of course, Cassandra has the entrepreneurial spirit, she took real initiative getting that business started. It wasn't easy, getting the capital together. We all had to make some sacrifices to help her, but it was worth it. Family supports family, that's how we've always done things. The table murmured warmly. Cassandra looked down at her plate. Dara was looking at me. And I heard it, the version my mother was still telling. The clean, generous version where everyone gave willingly, where sacrifices were mutual, where the story was simply one of a family pulling together. Where $89,400 that had belonged to me was just capital that appeared from a communal pool, made available by a family with its priorities in order. I set my fork down. I looked at my mother. And I said it quietly, the way you say something you have decided deserves to be heard plainly without decoration. That isn't what happened, Mom. The table shifted almost imperceptibly. Linda blinked. My father's expression stiffened. My mother's smile stayed in place, but her eyes changed. A very small recalibration. She said, softly and evenly, the way she said everything difficult, Leah, this isn't the time. I think it probably is, I said. Since you're explaining how the family handled things. I'd like the actual explanation to be on the table. Dara's hands were still. Paul had stopped eating. Linda was looking between my mother and me with the careful attention of someone who has just realized she is no longer at an ordinary dinner party. I spoke without raising my voice. Without anger. With the particular clarity that comes from having gone over something so many times in your own mind that you know exactly which words carry the weight and which ones you can leave out. The capital Cassandra used to start Wren and Company, I said, came from a fund my grandmother set aside for me specifically. Not for the family. For me. Designated in trust, administered by her attorney for 14 years. My parents transferred it to Cassandra's account 4 days before my grandmother died, using co-administration authority that did not cover that account. Without my knowledge. Without my consent. Without Gerald Mott's authorization. The bank reversed the transfer 8 months later after a formal compliance review. I paused. I let that land where it was going to land. I didn't make sacrifices, I said. I had something taken. Those are different things. The table was completely silent. The kind of silence that has texture to it, you can feel it pressing against the walls of the room. My mother's smile was gone. My father was looking at the tablecloth. Cassandra had not moved. Linda said, quietly, almost to herself, "Oh my." Dara looked at my mother. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The look said everything a woman says when she has suspected something for a long time and has just watched it confirmed in front of her in plain language. My mother drew breath. She said, her voice precise and controlled, "You are choosing to air private family business at a dinner table, and I think you should consider what that says about you." I looked at her. I held her gaze for a moment. Then I said the only thing left to say. You chose this table, Mom. I just told the truth at it. I picked up my fork. I continued eating. And the room, slowly, began breathing again, though it was not the same room it had been 60 seconds before, and we all knew it. No one at that table brought it up again. But no one forgot it either. Linda drove home that afternoon and told her husband. Dara called me the following Tuesday. She said simply, I should have said something years ago. I'm sorry I didn't. I told her she hadn't known what to say, and that was different from not caring, and I meant it. My mother did not speak to me for 4 months. When she finally called in August, her voice had none of its usual precision. She sounded smaller. She said she had done what she thought was right for the family and she was sorry if it had hurt me. It was the closest she had ever come to an apology. I told her I hurt her. I did not tell her it was enough, because it wasn't, and I had decided to stop pretending things were resolved when they weren't. Cassandra called a week later. She asked if she could repay the money directly to me, separate from whatever our parents did or didn't do. I told her the bank had already handled it, that Gerald had made sure of that, but that what she was offering mattered. We have spoken carefully, occasionally, since then. Not as we were. But honestly, which is more than we ever managed before. I finished my graduate degree in May 2024. Health Informatics, Ohio State. My Aunt Vera drove up from Dayton and sat in the 3rd row. I looked for my parents in the audience from habit, that old reflex. They weren't there. I had not invited them. I felt the absence the way you feel an old scar on a cold day, present, dull, manageable. In September 2024, I was hired as a health data systems director at a regional hospital network in Columbus. $91,000 a year. The job title my grandmother never got to hear, built entirely on a path I had funded and chosen myself. I still have her card. The small one. The undated one. I keep it in the inside pocket of the folder where I stored all the documents, Gerald's letters, the bank reversal notice, the trust instrument, all of it. I don't look at it often. But I know it's there. And knowing it's there is enough. She didn't give me the money so I would feel powerful. She gave it to me so I would feel free. So that when the moment came, whichever moment it turned out to be, I would have ground under my feet that no one could shift without consequences. She was right. She was always right. I just had to stop being quiet long enough to find out. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.